And you'll never prepare for everything that the players are going to
yeah.
throw at you. I mean, they'll immediately want
Never.
off script as soon as you begin. And that's both the horror and the joy of, you know, dice and paper gaming compared to writing a novel. You know, the characters do what I tell them. I am in charge. Whereas the games master is only in charge in a very superficial way. And the joy of it is the collaboration between the kind of games master and the players who will take you off in directions you never expected.
Hello and welcome back to Dicebreaker, where today I'm joined not only by my compatriot in all of these conversations, Liv Kennedy, but also I'm going to hand over to Joe Abercrombie, famed author, to introduce himself.
I'm a famed author, apparently. My name's Joe. I've been writing fantasy since, I think, about 2001, so about 600 years, it feels like, I've been writing fantasy. My first book, The Blade Itself, was published in 2006, and since then I've written 13 fantasy novels, translated into a multiplicity of languages and sold in their millions to adoring crowds throughout the world. Yes, I write fantasy novels. I make stuff up for a living.
Basically. Yeah, which is essentially what we do as well. Which makes us perfectly suited to talk about today's topic. So, Joe, I'm not sure if you've seen these before, but we like to sort of chat about, you know, kind of like an agony aunt for TTRPG players of how can I do certain things. And today's topic is building your own fantasy world for those who are looking to, you know, get out of the sort of source books of their standard RPG, whether it be D&D or anything really, and create their own sort of like setting for their campaigns. So we thought a fantasy author, despite all the derision that I've heard from yourself, would be perfectly suited to talk about that.
We're still hanging on your word.
You thought, and now will come the time when you realise your mistake.
Your folly.
Time to reap what we've sown. But yeah, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about how to build your own fantasy world, essentially. We're going to try and keep it general. So, like, if you're looking for more of like a steampunk or a sci-fi setting, that's fine. We're going to be trying to like sort of talk about the sort of basic rules of what makes things compelling and realistic, and how to make things stand out and not be quite as generic, perhaps. And then also just some like general tips about what pros and cons there are to certain things, what you should avoid, what you should strive for, and all that kind of stuff. But we'll start with the first question that we've got noted down. We've got them all pre-prepared because we're really, really good like that.
Yeah.
And obviously the main question that I think a lot of people who are doing this for the first time will be is, where do we start building our own fantasy world? Like, what are the first steps that we take? So Joe, we'll start with you because you are a special guest.
Absolutely.
Like when you were sort of like constructing got someone beeping outside. When you were sort of constructing the setting for your novels, like what was the sort of first steps you took in sort of realizing the world that they were in?
I mean, I guess I'm a big reader and consumer of fantasy going back many years. I grew up with Lord of the Rings, and then you know, there was this book, A Game of Thrones, which I think one day may be big. You know, we'll see. We'll see. I think that's potential. And you know, Dragonlance, and I was steeped in fantasy worlds, and so it was kind of a very small step to making up worlds of my own. And I think, you know, we all start by imitating things we love, and that's an entirely healthy and good way to go. You know, and you've got to, I think, always be asking yourself, what do I like? What's the stuff that appeals to me? You know, what are both the areas of the world and the type of world that appeal? And do what you're interested in, you know, because no one's doing this for work, or very few of us are doing it for work. We're not starting as a big work project generally. We're doing it because we love it and because we enjoy it. So do what you enjoy. You know, if you love Vikings, aim for a Viking, you know, influence world, some kind of, think about a version of the Baltic Sea with kingdoms clustered around an icy sea plied by trade from many cultures. You know, make that your basis. If you love Three Kingdoms era China, then think of a great and complicated and advanced empire that's dragged into civil war, what the factions in that war might be. You know, if you love magic towers in books, Put some magic towers in there.
Oh yeah, more magic towers, please.
Put 100, some variety of extraordinary tall building anyway, and do what's fun and what you enjoy. At least start there, and then you can begin to flesh it out. For me, I think a big mistake with world building is doing too much of it in a way, and feeling like you have to have every bit of history and every area of the map filled in right at the start. And in a way, a lot of the fun, if I'm writing a book, and I suppose the equivalent would be if you're running a campaign, then you want empty space that your players can wander into. You want to be able to improvise and make stuff up as you go, because you're never going to get everything right in an instant first pass. So build a skeleton that is exciting to you, and then give room for it to breathe and be fleshed out as you go, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of a unique sort of advantage you have with games like TTRPGs, especially if you as a GM are really good at thinking on your feet. You'll often find that those gaps that you've left, the players will naturally kind of fill them for you, because they'll implicitly just look for things that they're interested in. So if they're like, does X exist in this world? Like, is there any kind of sport that they play here or something like that? At that point, you can go, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, sure, why not? And then you can pretend you had all along.
And you'll never prepare for everything that the players are going to throw at you. I mean, they'll immediately want off script as soon as you begin. And that's both the horror and the joy of, dice and paper gaming compared to writing a novel. The characters do what I tell them. I am in charge. Whereas the games master is only in charge in a very superficial way. And the joy of it is the collaboration between the kind of games master and the players, who will take you off in directions you never expected.
Yeah, and I think the players will appreciate that as well, right? Because they don't... like, Liv, how many RPGs have we played now, right? Where it's like, you don't want to turn up where everything has already happened, right? You don't want a world in which you're just sort of like learning about things that happened 100 years ago and, nothing is relevant anymore. You want those players to be sort of ingrained in that.
Yeah, definitely. I also like that you've mentioned that you've got to make it exciting for you, because that's something that I really struggle with. If I'm not like super into what I'm doing, I'll just be like, just throw it together, it's fine, blah blah blah. But if I'm really excited about what I'm doing, like if I come up with like a really cool area or like a cool like situation and a bit of lore, like it really makes me want to just like explore more and like find out the world for myself, if that makes sense. So,
yeah, absolutely. And I think there's this temptation to feel Tolkien and his detail and his depth is still bestrides the genre to a degree, and is sort of seen as the gold standard up to a point of a certain type of fantasy anyway. And that's obviously hugely detailed. It has its own languages. It has very fleshed out kind of mythos and history, and you don't have to do that. You don't have to start with that before you get into something that's interesting. You don't have to kind of go, oh no, I've now got 4 centuries of history. I've got to work out what happened, between the Battle of Zarbulon and the fall of the Kingdom of Druth. I need to flesh that out and know. You don't need to know. It's better to get going on what's interesting in the present, and the drama and the conflict and the human stuff is always what makes a setting interesting.
Yeah, and Middle-earth's kind of a good example as well, where it's like, if you look at Lord of the Rings as novels, they do sort of wax lyrical about the world, but there is still a lot that is kind of implied rather than explicitly, just read out to you. And if you look at, for example, the Silmarillion, which is literally just like a sort of lore textbook, it's nowhere near as like beloved in sort of general populace, because it doesn't have the same level of human drama that is the central element of it. So I think something that is really important is when you are making these fantasy worlds, when you're building these locations that your players are going to be exploring and these stories that they're going to be able to weave themselves into, it's important to make sure that the narrative stays the most important thing, because if there is an element of your world building that you're really passionate about, but it makes it a real slog to actually play the game, then it's kind of losing its own purpose. And if you're just building that world to build the world because you're having fun, then it doesn't really matter. But as soon as you introduce like a story or players or anything that can poke holes and product things, that's when you need to be able to allow the other people around the table to collaborate and to be able to you know, say what they do and don't like about things. That there might be, you know, we talked about this in a previous video, there might be elements of your story that you think is the coolest thing that has ever existed. But if everyone around your table doesn't give a crap, then I'm afraid they just don't give a crap and they're not going to want to do anything with it. So yeah, it's, you know, it's
sheets of squared paper will remain at the back of the binder forever. Never thumbed over, never looked at, never needed.
Into the pyre.
What a shame.
But yeah, no, I think you mentioned to me before, Wheels, that you were like playing a campaign, or you started playing it, and because there was simply just nothing to do, like you traveled for ages and there was like nothing going on, and you didn't want to play anymore, right?
Yeah, it's like it's that issue of and this is one of the problems of overwriting, is it's not just the fact that you have put so much into it that it becomes rigid, but it's just like you know, your players are entering into a world that they want to feel like they have agency in. So if they feel like they're just sort of like picking from a selective list of things that they can do, then it's not going to feel like a true experience of like freedom and you know, finding their own story. And I think that will carry over into the world building as well, where it's a case of, if everything has already happened, if everything is already solidified in stone, then they're not going to feel like they're really part of that world. They're going to feel like tourists that are just sort of walking around like a, you know, a theme park or something, right? So there has to be an element of that where they can sort of imprint their own stamp on even just that small section of the world that they're there inhabiting. I guess this is, and now we're sort of like moving on to the next question, which is, or the one that we've got written down anyway, is how do I make my world compelling? So now that you've got the elements that you're interested in, let's say that there's, like Joe said, there's a sort of period of history that you really want to ape on, or, you know, there are certain fantasy novels that you really want to sort of like drain inspiration from, or you've just got like this wild idea in your head that you think would be really cool. How do you then make it interesting? Is the next question.
Which is kind of the big question in a way, and I'm sure there's no one answer to that, because, you know, in one sense, everyone's taste is different. Everyone finds different things compelling. You know, some players, some readers prefer things that are much more setting heavy. Others want, you know, are much more interested in dialogue or in action. But I think overall, or one important thing to bear in mind, is that, you know, geography is really just the set. It's the set in a film. A great set is good. It contributes, but it's far from the only thing, you know, and the acting and the dialogue and the direction are going to be in the end more important than the set. So I guess the equivalent thing in terms of your world building is that the drama, what's going on, what's producing kind of conflict and change within the world, is in a way much more important than the mountains and the rivers and that kind of stuff. So it's, where will that drama come from? What's the conflict? What's the change? You know, sometimes you get these medieval sandbox styles of world that feel quite static and sort of frozen in time. Nothing's changed for thousands of years. I like a world that's kind of dynamic and moving forward and has all these sources of conflict within them. So, you know, it's political, it's civil war, it's kind of change of a social nature, a sort of ongoing development that's creating change and drama. And I suppose then it's, you know, political opposition between power blocks and ideologies and that kind of thing. And I suppose it's economic and technological movement forward as well. You know, those are all kind of useful engines for drama and for different characters to be on different sides of issues, if you like. So I suppose compelling to me is a world that's lived in and moving and changing, and that the characters are kind of dropped into and become part of that bigger scene. And from a role-playing game standpoint, I suppose that means, you know, that you try and make the characters actors within a wider political and cultural setting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the kind of, so recently myself and our fellow video producer Maddie, we made a video on how to make NPCs, and something we discussed was how the collaborative storytelling process can be really helpful there. Because if your character says, oh, I want to be from like this region and this thing has happened to me and blah blah blah, I feel like that can also tie into like building your world and making it compelling for them. Because if they say, oh, I want to be from like this area that's currently in economical crisis, and like you know, things are falling apart at the moment, like that just gives you a bit of the world already. And then you can just kind of like spider out from that and be like, well, what's the source of that? Who's in charge? Like, why isn't anyone doing anything? Yeah, like so I think that that's also a fun way of being able to, you know, have like a starting point and also make it compelling for the people that you'll be playing with. So
yeah, I think there's this principle in story writing of which is like a bit of advice that I got in like a creative writing course or something like that, which is I've been told it's quite widespread, but essentially it's, you know, is this the most interesting part of your main character's life, and if not, why are you not writing about that? So I think there is that element of like, you know, is this the most interesting situation that this world could be in? Like, is this you know, the most active this sort of political landscape has ever been? Because if it's not, then your players are sort of seeking something out. Whereas if there is always stuff happening around them, naturally they will be drawn to the things that interest them. They'll be drawn to the, you know, the, like you said, the power blocks, the sort of most align with their morality or their goals or whatever it is. But it's also that case of like you said, Liv, it's, you know, the collaborative experience that you get from TTRPGs, sometimes it seems quite daunting, I think, to new GMs, where it's just like, oh no, they can break everything that I make. But you know, it's almost like a frame of mind that you need to adopt, where it's instead of having to be the person that creates everything, you have this sort of collection of minds, these like-minded people. Because most of the time, if you're playing an RPG with a group of friends, like, you like these people, you like similar things, like you have similar interests. Yeah. And those things are going to naturally sort of like coalesce together, and all of the different things that people have better understandings of or more interest in will naturally stand out from each other, right? So I had this experience of this game I was playing. It was like a sort of homebrewed thing that we put together, where it was essentially we were all sort of like this small council of petty kingdoms. We were meeting up for these sort of small council meetings. And essentially the world had been created in a way that it was like, okay, well, here's your petty kingdom. What does that world look like? And they were kind of made in isolation. And it made that world more compelling, more interesting, because it wasn't just one mind saying, well, here's like, you know, here's the desert part of the world, and here's how desert things work, and here's the ice part of the world, or whatever it is, where it's, you know, you can see almost the structure in the way that the world is built. It's very much like this is something that has been put together by one person. It's all very perfectly aligned and everything like that. Whereas the natural chaos you get from loads of different independently created sort of cultures and ideals and iconographies and all that kind of stuff that you get from individual players making their stamp on the world naturally makes a more sort of compelling and lifelike setting, where it's like, you know, that is what our world is like. There, if you travel from one country to another country on the other side of the world, the way in which things are thought about, the way in which language is constructed, everything like that is going to be very, very different. And whilst there's going to be sort of like, you know, 3 points for everyone, where there will be threads that join us, like, you know, everyone needs to eat, for example. How does the food work in this place? You know, it's not necessarily going to be the same answer, but it's the same question for a lot of people. But the differences are what makes it so interesting. And then you also have that melting pot, that hotbed of competition, and you know, certain ideals not meshing well with others and ending up in clashes. And that world just sort of, it's already alive. Like it doesn't take too much effort then to imagine, oh well, these two have very, very different feelings on religion. Like, are they going to start butting heads? Or you know, this nation is very food rich, this nation is very food poor. Is there going to be some kind of conflict between them, or some kind of, you know, oppression that the rich nation is going to have? Thinking about the world as like a living, breathing organism, I think is really useful for that kind of thing.
Definitely.
So I guess we're already sort of talking about it, and I think these 2 points sort of feed into each other really well, because a compelling world is one that, you know, you don't have to suspend your belief too much to believe in, right? It's something that makes sense intrinsically, and sometimes you're going for something that specifically doesn't make sense, which can be really fun if you're trying to you know, circumnavigate people's expectations and things like that. But I guess the next question then is, how do you make this world realistic?
Yeah, I mean, realistic is a really kind of charged and difficult word with fantasy. In a way. It's both something that, you know, people hold up as something very desirable. You want it to feel authentic and rigorous and kind of concrete, like a real place. But at the same time, fantasy by its very nature isn't real. Well, all fiction isn't real. It's all made up to a degree. But particularly in fantasy, often we're dealing with things that are quite obviously unrealistic, like dragons that, defy the laws of physics, or magic, or very, very tall fantastical buildings. To return to that,
bring in the towers. Yes.
And you might have a taste for something that's really wild and crazy and out there. I don't know if you know China Miéville's books, Perdido Street Station. Insane city, completely impossible. One part of it is built under the giant ribs of a decayed corpse. One part of it, has mad steampunk stuff going on. It has people remade with sort of guns built into their bodies and all sorts of, it's completely mad. But at the same time, it feels kind of very concrete and very authentic and very kind of real in a way, despite being obviously not real. So it's a very difficult question. And I think in a way you need to pick those things that matter to you to try and keep real. So in my case, when I'm writing a world, I very much want the people and the psychology of the people and the way they behave to feel like the way people might behave in reality, if you like. I think that's important to try and maintain. In terms of the world itself, I mean, one, useful thing is to read some history, read a lot of history, read about things that interest you. And, the real world is full of detail and arresting kind of moments and things that will give a setting a sense of authenticity. The Vikings built long houses that were dug into the ground and they were half subterranean and they had a kind of shelf around them. And once you know what those houses look like, suddenly you can kind of see it a little bit more. And those sort of details will give something a sense of authenticity, if not making them realistic. And I guess in terms of a games master running a game, you might need to produce a lot of stuff very quickly. You might need a general sense of what something's like. And so to be able to say, well, this place is maybe a little bit like Renaissance Italy. It's feuding city-states with kind of very unreliable politics. And this place is maybe like feudal Japan. It's on a bound. It kind of has powerful families under a not very powerful overall authority. That gives you a sort of shorthand that you could then apply quite quickly. So at least you can get a bit of a sense of what a place might be like, of how different cultures might differ. And that gives you a kind of seed from which you can then, extrapolate and work in more ideas of your own. So perhaps the characters go off-piste and they go somewhere that you haven't really thought about much. That at least is something to get you started, and then you can work out more of the details later, I guess.
Yeah. Those touchstones are really important. Sorry, Dave, you carry on.
I was just going to say that I feel like a lot of game masters who are planning out their world, myself included, sometimes can be a little bit hesitant and just think to yourself like, well, I have to come up with this whole thing just from my mind, and that is purely it. Like, I can't take inspiration from things because then it's just bleh. It's not going to be as good. But like, it's perfectly reasonable to just like maybe watch a documentary, read a book, like just like check out things that you think that are interesting to you. The interesting thing really resonates with me quite a lot. But yeah, just like don't be afraid to like take inspiration from other places, Joe, like as you were saying.
Yeah, there's definitely like a sense of like that there is nothing new under the sun, right? So like at some point you are going to end up doing something that's been tried before. But it's not necessarily, it's not the idea that's important, it's the execution, right? Like it's not the the theme that you're going for, it's how invested you are in that theme and how interesting you can make that theme to your players and how interested like you yourself are in the world that you're making. I think for me, like realism isn't necessarily a case of, is there like a scientific explanation for how this dragon can lift itself up in the air with its wings? It's more that sort of internal consistency of the world. Like does this world stick to its own rules? And if not, is that intentional or is that a mistake, right? It's like, is there like is there like a strange magic in this world and like how understandable is that system of magic, for example. Like you look at sort of, look at Star Wars with the Force, right? It's, it was the Force, it was explainable away, and you could just say, oh, it's the Force. And then as the sort of prequels came in and they introduced like midi-chlorians and tried to sort of explain the fine details of how everything worked, as soon as you make a very, very strict set of rules, then it becomes, okay, but what does that mean now? Like, how does this work with that framework? And, as you make things more complicated and you make things more sort of written and hard and fast rule set, it becomes more and more difficult to actually be able to understand the sort of small parts of your world and things like that. Like, it becomes more difficult to explain away and hand wave things where you can just sort of say, oh, it's magic, right? Like they're using magic, or they're blessed by some god and that's why they can do these things. And I think it's like there is this sort of intrinsic need that we all have to explain everything and to have like a full Wikipedia that explains every single facet of information you could possibly have in a world. But sometimes that can really hamstring you, especially in a TTRPG where you don't have the luxury of sort of cutting away from things that you think are, like, don't look behind the curtain sort of elements, because naturally your players are going to be like, well, what is behind the curtain, because I'm interested now. So yeah, like keeping things loose, keeping things, like sort of explainable in a way that makes sense inside the world is really useful, I think.
Mystery and the unknown and the bit of the map that isn't filled in are really powerful tools. They're everyone's watched horror films and been fascinated until they saw the monster, at which point suddenly the whole thing's a bit so not explaining stuff and deliberately hiding things and creating senses of mystery, I think is very important to making a world compelling.
I think there will be moments, and I've had this happen in a lot of TTRPGs, where you will have something that you just haven't prepared for, that you haven't explained in your mind, and then a player will go, oh my god, I figured it out, it's this, and you can just go, yeah, it is. Well done. Yeah.
You got me. No. Scribble down very rapidly.
Yeah, like there's there's so much burden placed on the games master to have this like perfectly planned out thing, but there are so many ways in which you can just cheat, and cheating's great.
Official Dicebreaker stance. Cheating is great.
Official Dicebreaker motto. Cheating is fantastic. And there's like you said, Liv, there's that thing of not wanting to steal from other people, but it's the old phrase of great artists steal, right? Like knowing how to draw inspiration for something is one of the most important things of being a fictional author, right? It's like it's knowing what is so important or interesting or fascinating about the thing that you are sort of focusing on right now, and extracting the small parts of it that you actually really want to talk about. Understanding your own mind almost.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a reason why classic things become classic. Because they work really well, like magical tall buildings, for example. I mean, they're just exciting. They look good from a distance. A lot of stairs, hard to get to, dramatic. You can fall off them. There's just a lot. There's a lot going on there. And it all works. So I think originality is a little bit overrated sometimes, or at least a very small amount of it is enough. I guess the whole genre of westerns is based around doing the same thing over and over with variations of approach and style. Something like Unforgiven. I mean, we're going off piste here slightly, but that film, if you describe it, is exactly like every other western ever. It sounds like 1,000 others, but the approach and the grittiness of it and the way the characters are, makes it fascinating all over again.
And there's also there's power in just clashing things together as well. Like, it might not be very unique to tell the classic western tale, and it might not be very unique to have like a sort of sci-fi film, but the original Star Wars was essentially just clashing those two things together, right? It was just, what if we told a western in space, and then there it was, right? If there are two things that you really love, like if you love cowboys and you love, I don't know, dragons, like what does a world in which dragons exist in a wild western setting look like? Immediately
Dragon Boys.
Like, ooh, cool.
Boys,
Come to my dragon ranch.
Dangerous ranch.
But you talked about horror films as well there, Joe, and like that's a really good example of like internal consistency, because I think horror films, for them to be scary, your audience has to suspend its disbelief. It has to sort of like believe in what's happening to these characters, And if the world doesn't follow its own rules, like if it just starts inventing things for the sake of it, and like, you know, it's almost being counterintuitive to the setup that it's given you as a watcher, then eventually you start to lose your immersion. You start to go, oh, I don't really understand what's happening anymore. Like, why is he now able to teleport? Where did that come from? Etc. Etc.
Yeah, I know exactly the films you're talking about. The series of films. Yeah.
But if you have like a strict set, it's like, okay, this thing is very powerful. Like, it is able to do this, but it also has this kind of weakness. Then, you know, there is like a very logical framework that the human mind can then follow and be like, oh god, but now they can't do this, but maybe they can do that. Oh, but the lights have gone out. That's bad. You know, all that kind of stuff. And you don't have to keep continuously inventing things to make your world compelling, as long as they are sort of, they're interesting enough to keep your players hooked. If you start getting too frivolous with the amount of ideas that you show into stuff, they'll start clashing together, and you know, it's sometimes like less is more is the very obvious way of saying that. Like, it's always tempting to just sort of shove as many ideas into a melting pot as you can, but sometimes just having two really strong, maybe three, maybe even one ideas that you want to explore, and just really focusing on them, letting everything else just sort of work itself out in the process, is going to be a much more strong and stable sort of bedrock for that story that you're telling, that world that you're building.
Yeah.
So we will move on to the sort of last few questions that we have. The last sort of major one, which I think is, you know, something that we've sort of like briefly touched on with a few of the questions, and I think will be something that a lot of people have, you know, like reservations about when they're making the world, which is like, how can I make my world stand out? Like, how can I make this, you know, different from stuff that people have played before? And whilst we've talked about, you know, how that's not necessarily the most important goal in the world, like sometimes just doing the same thing that you're comfortable with will lead to better results because you're better executing with that. But what are a few tips for people who are sort of like making the world, that they want a few little things that make people look at the, you know, small details they've added and go, ooh, that's cool, you know, like what's like a general approach for that kind of thing from your perspective, Joe?
I mean, it's a tough one, because again, as with the realism, I think there's a question over the degree to which you want it to stand out and to be original. We were kind of talking about originality being something that is talked of as though it's an unalloyed good, but you know, it's not always. Often you're working within kind of the rules of story and expectations, and you want to fulfill expectations more than you break them often. So in a way, I think if you're going about generating a world and creating a world, that's the last thing you should be worried about, in a sense. How will this stand out? How will it be original? How will I amaze people with my cleverness? You should just be trying to create something, you know, solid and effective, and then it will come to stand out by what you do with it, in a sense. And the kind of the people that are in the setting and the drama that you create are in the end much more important, I think, than making the setting itself stand out. But again, I think going back to history and doing a little bit of enjoyable research is always useful, to find some of those kind of arresting details that are, you know, going to make something interesting and exciting and give you a few kind of tentpole events and things that can make the players feel like they're in something they haven't heard 1,000 times before, if that makes sense. Because history is just full of crazy events and examples that you could never dream up in a million years. And I think that will, you know, help to make the world feel fleshed out. The last series that I wrote was set during kind of Industrial Revolution, and so I was reading around the subject a little bit, and I kind of read that in the slums of Victorian cities, they would keep pigs in the street. You know, the street would be chopped up into little enclosures in front of every house. They'd all keep pigs, and they'd toss the scraps out to the pigs, and then in winter they'd butcher the pigs and eat them. The result of that was that there was just a constant noise of pigs all the time in the slums. The slums just sounded like slaughterhouses.
That sounds horrible.
Full of pigs, stunk of pigs, rubbish everywhere. And I didn't know that. You know, I mean, that may not be true universally, but it was certainly true in Manchester, say. So I didn't know that at all. I'd never heard that before. But obviously, when you start writing a scene in those circumstances, it colors everything and creates a very sort of powerful sense. It feels real and believable because it is. It creates a lot of atmosphere. It doesn't necessarily change anything fundamental, but the effect on the kind of setting and the tone, and it says a lot about the people and the place and the poverty, and then you're thinking these are very, very poor people. Where are the rich people? What's the dynamic? What's the drama between them? So I think it's that kind of small detail can spin out to create, you know, a lot of mood and atmosphere potentially.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that, because I think you're going to have a lot of trouble like making a whole world stand out. Like it's going to be derived from something. But yeah, the small things will definitely, for me, make the difference. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I think the things that people remember are the small moments that they have that feel like they were personal and unique, and like especially in TTRPGs where like you are like a small group of people in a large world. Hearing these grand sweeping things of there was a great war with the dragons and all that kind of stuff, it's like it might be interesting. And for some players it might not be, but you know, like it's still, you know, intangible. Like the human mind is only so good at you know, big numbers and big events and all that kind of stuff. Eventually it all just becomes like this kind of you know, ethereal picture book of things happening, whereas like small human moments are way more effective for selling how this world works and what makes it interesting, stuff like that. You know, the pigs, for example, is such a unsettling image as well as sort of realistic. It really sets a tone for the storytelling. If there's screaming pigs everywhere, you know, pigs being the thing that, you know, mobsters feed bodies to and stuff like that, like it adds that element of like, oh god, like what is it like on the streets? Yeah. But I think even small things like for example in cinema there's a trick where if you want to make someone seem really unsettling and menacing, you can have them commit mass murder and do dark, horrible things and say terrible things and stuff like that. But one of the most effective things that I've seen people do is having them drink milk. There's just something very weird about like a sinister man like drinking milk, like something that you associate with like children and stuff like that.
Yeah,
reach for my milk while I consider that.
It's that small little thing where it's like, oh, that's a bit unsettling. That tiny little thing I've noticed has made me feel a bit uncomfortable. There's something that you do like that with character design, right? Where it's like, you know, you can have all these grand designs about like all the fashion they wear and the scars they have and all that kind of stuff. But that small thing of like, you know, every time they say the name of a certain person, their eye twitches. And it's just like, oh, okay, what's happening there? You know, like there's those small little motions. And if you can do that with your world, because your world is just a character, right? It's just a large character that you're all interacting with at the same time. And you can do those little things like, oh, you know, whenever two people meet in this city, they bump their elbows together or something like that. Like there's this, where's that come from? What's that strange greeting that everyone does? Like, why do people do that? Those little things will make your world seem really unique. Where in actual fact, like it might be really what some people would call generic fantasy or whatever. Like it might just seem like a really normal high fantasy world. But I think those little small details, those little really personal touches are the kind of thing that only you can really do. You know, leaning on the stuff that only you really know and only really you have experienced will bring out something that is unique because it's just personal, you know.
Yeah, it's bringing this back to a TTRPG I'm playing at the moment. A good example of that is that like there are little things that our party are like, okay, that's for us to investigate and explore. But when we hear like stuff about the lore and stuff that's going on in like other realms and like stuff that is just on a huge grand scale, well, like that's nothing to do with us because it's so big. It's like, that's great world building. Surely that's nothing to do with us. We're just a group of tiny little adventurers. Like, yeah. So I think bringing things in on a smaller scale is definitely something to think about. And having lore is great, but like think about, like it's good to try and think about things through your party's eyes as well, if you can.
Yeah. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely that thing of, you know, if you do have an ancient battle with dragons, how does that affect here and now?
Yeah.
You know, are there corpses of dragons scattered about the countryside? You know, are there a order of knights who are the descendants of the winners who, you know, see the defeat of dragons as the great defining righteousness of this world? You know, how does it become something that is present and current and relevant? Because if it's not, then who cares?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's well, like for example, like if you've got this grand sweeping history, like you can really play with that by having such a complete disparate future that you're actually living in, where it's just like, everyone talks about all the amazing things we used to do, but things really suck right now. So you've then got that interesting sort of clash between like culture and reality, where it's like, yeah, okay, cool, I'm glad you defeated dragons 1,000 years ago, but no one can afford to eat right now, so can we do something about that? But yeah, so I think we'll round off this with like a few general tips. Like if anyone's got any things that they think that they should, people building world should avoid, or they should strive for, or they should, maybe think about, like, go for it now.
Go wild.
Go wild.
Well, avoid being bored.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, going back to the earlier ones, I think there's this sense of a responsibility to make the world rather than to make the thing you're making. If you're writing a book, you're making a book. You're writing a story. You're not there to obsessively detail the setting in which it takes place and to write the appendices, if you will. That's not wasted effort, but it's a lot less worth than the effort that goes into actually making the dialogue and the characters and the stuff that happens on the page. From a gaming point of view, don't get too carried away in the background and the bits and pieces that aren't interesting. I mean, it's all got to go towards making that experience for the players and telling that story and getting them to tell a kind of exciting story within your framework. So never bore yourself, because life's too short to work hard at something that in the end is not that necessary and needs to be fun. And I think people will feel your enjoyment of it and your excitement in it, and they'll feel your boredom with it if once you become bored. So never get bored, just move on.
I think my big tip is look outside of Western fantasy, like look outside of Europe. Like there is so much, when you're looking for inspiration, you're looking for stuff that you want something new. You're tired of the tropes, all that kind of stuff. You want something new. Whilst it should be, you shouldn't appropriate those things. Like you can still be inspired by them, right? There's a lot of ways in which the world is seen from a completely different lens that you can experience by just stop reading about orcs and elves and like read about the hopping vampires of China, or like the half-bodied monsters of the Philippines or stuff like that. Like look at the ways in which other cultures do mythology and think, oh wow, like I've never seen something like that, right? Because that's when you can then say, okay, well, I'm not going to try and steal that, but like it still inspired me, and I've got this idea for something. And then people will be like, wow, how did you think of that? And it's just I just looked around. I just read stuff that's a bit different from what we're used to.
I think for me, something that really helps me is that you can draw inspiration from books and television and other media like that. But I find that literally just listening to different kinds of music really helps me. It helps me like immerse myself in like different areas of the world, and like, yeah, it just really helps me kind of not get into character for it, but kind of like in a way, I suppose, just kind of, just immerse myself. Also, I think a lot of people worry about like building a huge and complicated map of like the world that they're making, which is great if you have the tools or the artistic prowess to do it. But like, don't worry about making it too complicated. You can have a bog standard map if that helps you kind of like visualize it more. Just don't be afraid to just make something that isn't super pretty. Like it doesn't have to be pretty, just as long as it can help you like visualize. Then like, don't be afraid to branch out in that.
The geography is not going to make your world the most interesting place. Like it's what happens in that geography, right? So don't get sort of shoehorned into making big fantasy landscapes if you're not actually really going to do anything with them.
Yeah, exactly. If it helps you to do it, great. But like, there's no pressure to actually do that.
In the end, the story is told in close-ups, and the map is the widest shot imaginable. So it's kind of interesting up to a point, but it's not the way that your players or the people in the world would see it. You don't see it from above looking down. You see it from inside, and it's more important to get into that mindset, I think, than to avoid the sense of the kind of godlike omniscience.
I think one of my players once asked me for a map of the world, and I was like, what? No.
No. How dare you? How much time do you think I have? But yeah, again though, it's that thing of, you know, hard coding that. As soon as you've made that map, that is the map. So now it's just like, oh well, crap, I really wanted like this big island of whatever to exist, but it's nowhere on the map now. So now I need to shoehorn something else in. So like as soon as you hard code something into your world, like you need to then either retcon it, which is obviously a lot easier in a TTRPG, or you need to sort of work around it. So as soon as you can sort of like just free yourself from that mindset of just keep things loose, like focus on the stuff that matters, everything else will just fill itself out in the background. But yeah,
a huge part of the medieval world was they didn't have maps.
Yeah,
not good ones anyway. They had, you know, real guesswork maps that were totally inaccurate and had loads of white spaces, and you know they knew where some coastlines were, but not a lot inside. I mean, people didn't know what the interior of Africa was like in detail until very recently. It was terra incognita. It was unknown, and you know the world was full of this unknown, which they filled with monsters and madness. So you know, I think an equivalent world should have a lot of the unknown in it.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up there. A big thank you to Joe for joining us. Do you want to just take this opportunity to tell us where we can find more about you and your works?
I'm on Twitter at Lord Grimdark. Wasn't my idea. I take no responsibility. And www.joeabercrombie.com. And you can find my books in good bookstores and some not so good ones even. And I think my latest book, The Wisdom of Crowds, is out in paperback soon. Let's say soon. Yes, and it's excellent. My mum is also thoroughly endorses it.
That's all I needed.
It's the most important review, yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Joe. It's been lovely to have your insights.
It's a pleasure.
We have been Dicebreaker. If you've enjoyed this, then please do stick around, hit subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notified whenever we put a new video live. You can also find us on Dicebreaker.com, where we are doing our own wordsmithing with all sorts of reviews and interviews and previews and anything that you can imagine from the world of tabletop and beyond. Thanks so much for watching. We will see you on the next one. But until then, have a lovely day. Goodbye.
Bye.